Watching our special coverage here on India Today. Sorry, let me do that again. Ready? Special coverage here on India Today, the Davos brainstorm at the World Economic Forum in Davos in Switzerland. All eyes have been predictably on Donald Trump over the last 24 hours, and there's plenty more to talk about. Joining us now on this Trumpian world order that we are trying to unravel are two very special guests. Martin Wolf, Chief Economics Commentator at the Financial Times, and Ravi Agrawal, Editor-in-Chief of Foreign Policy. Appreciate both of you joining us. I set off today by suggesting that Harold Wilson, one of your Prime Ministers, Martin, in Britain, said a week is a long time in politics. With Donald Trump, it's less than 24 hours. What have you made out of that extraordinary attack that we saw 24 hours ago by Donald Trump on the European allies, and then, of course, backing off? But how do you see all of this? I mean, have you ever experienced anything like this in your long track record of covering geoeconomics and geopolitics?
The simple answer is no. In fact, I am reasonably well educated. I was a classicist, so I read lots of Latin Greek history, and I've read about Indian history. I can't think of a political leader like this before. Obviously, we can see echoes with others, you know, the megalomania, the Trump-Kennedy Center, all the rest of it. That sort of looks classic dictatorial kitsch and megalomania. But like the volatility of policy making, the unpredictability of policy making, big policy decisions. I mean, a few days ago, no, yesterday, we thought he was going to launch a trade war for sure, and possibly a real war on a NATO ally. And this was the tightest, most durable, most powerful military alliance underpinned by values there's ever been. So it's really extraordinary. It was inconceivable. We've already known, it's clear from the national security strategy that they launched last year, that they do regard, or parts of it administration, regard the Europeans as the great enemy. In my view, I've written about this because they're too much like the Democrats. But the point is, we don't know what that's where we were, and now today we're apparently told, yeah, it's all off. So I don't know what to make of this, except I can only quote at the end the famous line from my dear colleague Robert Armstrong, Taco, Trump always chickens out. Well, he doesn't always, but this time he seems to have.
That's right. He didn't chicken out when it came to Venezuela. He didn't chicken out really when it came to Iran a few months ago. Ravi, what are you making out of what happened? I was seeing you typing away furiously a comment soon after the Trump speech. You probably had to revise your column a few hours later. What do you make out of Donald Trump and what he's doing, not just in the last 24 hours, but really in the last 12 months?
You know, so I think taco is a great phrase to use with Trump.
Trump always chickens out.
Trump always chickens out. But it doesn't apply to everyone. He chickens out when there are bigger powers or collections of powers that cumulatively represent a threat to him in some form. With other leaders, smaller countries, mid-sized economies, it's more FAFO, F around and find out, you know. In other words...
You say that again? FAFO. F around?
F around and find out. Sorry, I know this is a family channel.
No, that's good.
But the implication there is that Trump feels that we are in a world in which might is right, and that the United States has the biggest, most powerful army and economy in the world, and it can have its way with smaller powers. So, for example, in the last year, we've seen Trump quite famously now step back from the brink with China the minute China decided to exercise some control over its rare earths. It has a complete monopoly on the processing of critical minerals and rare earths. And that was the end of a phase of, you know, a growing trade war between the United States and China. Trump backed off in the face of threats. But when it comes to Venezuela, you mentioned, he went ahead, broke international law and domestic law because he felt there were no consequences. So what will be very interesting to see when the dust settles on yesterday's event is what has actually emerged from this so-called, quote-unquote, future deal with NATO. Because, you know, if it is that the United States has emerged with everything that it had before, which was the ability to have more troops in Greenland, bases that it already has, then this was all smoke and mirrors. If, however, there are some suggestions that the United States may get small pockets of sovereign bases within Greenland, then Trump might have something to show for it. Mark Rutte, the head of NATO, of course, cannot negotiate that. You need Denmark to do the negotiating there. But either way, this is all much of a muchness. Rajdeep, the bigger thing here is that he barely talked about Ukraine in his speech yesterday, and ultimately that is the big threat that Europe faces.
Martin, you wanted to add something.
And Ravi might well have a view of this, but what I'm reading, I'm not there, is that there are two possible linked other factors. One is, it's very clear from the polls, to me, that Trump's popularity is waning. And this might explain why there seems to be some credible pushback in parts of Congress. It became pretty clear, at least some senators' comments, they really weren't very keen on supporting the president if he started a war with NATO, as it were. And one of the reasons they might be braver now is they actually feel Trump coattails and also his damage that he can do to them are weaker. He's weaker. And
you actually think Trump has become weaker as
I'm not saying he has. I have no idea. What I'm saying is that Congress is behaving in a way, for the reason I suggest, which indicates that they think they can be bolder, and that would imply that they think Trump is weaker. They're less vulnerable to him, and if that's the case, that does matter for Trump. So he won't want, and he's a very political animal, he doesn't want to get into a big fight with people who do have genuine power. The Senate has genuine power, of course, and so it may be that when he was backing off, it wasn't just he didn't want a war with NATO, as it were. He actually doesn't want to go to territory where he might lose critical support at home.
Interesting, because there are those who believe not just in that what Donald Trump is doing, while he talks about American power, he's actually, in a sense, retreating from the US's role across the world as this dominant power, that he's actually going to leave America weaker by taking on allies, by, in a sense, reaching out to strongmen like Vladimir Putin or President Xi in China. Do you get that sense that if Trump takes this forward over the next 12 months, he's only going to weaken American power and leave America more isolated?
In my view, yes. Not in his view. I think Trump doesn't see power the way you or I do. America's secret sauce over the last 80 years has been its network of alliances. The fact that other countries don't seek to balance it, they seek to join it. Every time there's another great power, China, Russia, other powers try to balance it. With America, they try to join it. Trump doesn't see that as a strength. Instead, rather than the subtlety of alliances and what I just mentioned, Trump likes blunt force. He looks back to a more imperial and performative imperial form of American strength and power, and that's what we're seeing. He wants to use American military might, and it almost seems like he's only just discovering what he can do with the American military. If you look at Venezuela, but also Iran last year, he likes the idea of short, sharp bursts of American military might. He doesn't want to get embroiled in longer wars. Remember, again, Trump really came of the view that the Iraq war and the Afghanistan wars were extremely damaging to the United States, and it's not popular. So I don't see us going back to that era either.
But it is also at one level, Martin Wolf, about it's the economy stupid. At the moment, the American economy has shown some resilience, but there are signs of inflation rising, possibly jobs slowing down, and maybe the economy will slow down. Some talk of the R word, recession. Your sense, will that in a way be the critical factor over the next 12 months? How the domestic economy performs, because with midterm elections coming up in the United States in November, Donald Trump surely must recognize the limits of his power if the economy doesn't really hold any longer.
The elections are going to be incredibly important. That's absolutely clear. And given the situation, it is, if there's any normal midterm adjustment, he will lose the House of Representatives. It seems, from what I understand, very unlikely that he will lose the Senate, but you can't be sure. And that will depend very much on just how disgusted the American people are with him. We have very clear signs that a very significant proportion of Americans don't like a lot of the things which are non-economic that have been done. ICE operating in immigration customs enforcement body, operating freely in cities, shooting people without any comeback. It makes people frightened. Remember, he did incredibly well with Hispanic voters. If they feel, well, I could be pulled off the street and put in custody, like that, all that's important. And clearly, there are a lot of people, even supporters, who are quite uncomfortable with this. But of course, if the economy really goes bad, they've got a big unemployment problem. Unemployment is quite high. If inflation starts rising, and if we don't know what the new Fed is going to do, it may not happen. But if it does, very strong economy, goosed up further by the Fed, there may be a good employment outcome, but inflation might rise. Lots of economists I've been in a discussion think it will go up to 4% plus. If that happens, and the outcome is an electoral defeat on this scale, it will weaken him enormously. There's no doubt about it. So he's always, the economy is stupid is the right thing, and he must be worried about it.
So Ravi, looking ahead to the next 12 months, and I know 12 months is a very long time, it almost seems like an eternity, but if we were to meet again a year from now in Davos, how do you see the world? Will it be as unstable and as unsettled as it appears today? The crisis in Iran, Trump's Donroe doctrine taking over parts of the Western Hemisphere, a sense that you don't just know what happens next. Do you believe the world will be in a more settled place 12 months from now? Or with Donald Trump, the next 3 years, we're on a roller coaster?
It's not just Donald Trump. I think even if America were to have a new leader in 3 years' time, the instability that we're seeing right now has just gotten started. And I'll tell you why. Mark Carney, Canada's Prime Minister, was very clear in his speech, which was excellent, on Tuesday, in which he said there is a rupture in the world order. And what he meant by that was that some of what we've been discussing about Trump's might makes right world. But he also made very clear that other countries aren't going to just stand by. They're going to find other alliances. Canada and China, for example, within the space of 1 year, they've gone from being countries that couldn't talk to each other publicly to now cutting tariffs on electric vehicles and so on and so forth.
India is about to sign a big deal with the European Union, a big trade deal with
the EU has done so with Mercosur, the South American bloc. There is a sense that countries are getting on with their business, but even that is not settled and stable. I see the next few years as an interregnum between world orders. We don't know what's coming next. All we know is that the here and now is chaotic, it is messy, and it is Trumpian.
What do we see on the other side of this world order? Are we entering, as the German Chancellor said, a completely new world order?
My view is very close to Ravi's. My view, and I wrote about this in my column yesterday, we are moving into an era of disorder, period. The only power that had the capacity to enforce an order, and did so, for all the problems and failures over the last, since the Second World War, 80 years, was the US. And that was because it was the biggest economy. It had enormously powerful institutions of soft power, universities, media, and all the rest of it. And it was trusted by a very large number of countries. Not absolutely, made huge mistakes, and it had very powerful allies. I believe, and just to underline this, the US we used to know is gone. Whatever happens now, Trump will, as it were, we can't forget Trump, and we can't forget the possibility that even if he is defeated, he goes in the next presidential election and a Democrat, he can come back. That America is gone. And nobody can take its place. So what we're going to have is countries doing deals, but those deals will be unstable because they will always be hedging against one another because the EU and China may do a deal, but they will always be hedging. India will be hedging. And so in a hedging world, nothing has that sort of stability. So there isn't going to be a new order. Global orders are unnatural. The one we've lived in was a historical freak. It's never happened before, and I think it won't happen again.
So it's the new world disorder in a way, which is, Ravi, an exciting time to be a journalist. As I said, Ravi was typing away furiously after the Trump speech for foreign policy, giving his comment, and then probably had to change it a few hours later. So it's actually making foreign policy in real time now. There's no time to think anymore. It's a pretty exciting time to be commentators and journalists.
It is, but if I had to pick between that time and stability, I would pick the stability. And the reason is, I don't think this chaos, this mess, is necessarily good for the world.
Okay, we leave it at that. Martin Wolf and Ravi Agrawal for giving us an insightful analysis of this Trumpian world disorder, as we are now calling it. Appreciate you joining us here on India Today. Let's take a break at this point. You're watching our special coverage, India Today's Davos Brainstorm. Back with a little bit more.